certainly over recent years, we've had much more variety of feed ingredients. We look at how this is going to affect our farmers, the folks who are there day to day raising our birds for us. That is essential to keep our birds healthy in a no antibiotics ever environment.
Welcome to Unplucked, the official podcast of the Poultry Science Association. This is the podcast where we strip away the fluff and get real about poultry science from bench to barn. I'm your host, Andy Vance, Executive Director of the Poultry Science Association. In this week's episode, we're joined by Randy Mitchell, Vice President of Nutrition at Perdue Farms and the newest fellow of the Poultry Science Association, enshrined with our association's highest honor earlier this year at our annual meeting and North American Scientific Conference. In our conversation with Dr. Mitchell, we're going to dive into the science and strategy behind Perdue's pioneering move to all vegetarian feed and its work on antibiotic-free poultry production and what that has meant for the growth and development of the industry in the marketplace. Dr. Mitchell shares the nutritional innovation, the challenges, and the integrity it takes to lead that kind of change at scale, one of the largest poultry producers in the world, plus provide some insights for future scientists and producers shaping the next chapter of the poultry industry. Dr. Mitchell, I want to start with your story because one of my favorite things about annual meeting each year is getting to know our fellows and hearing them tell your story. What I want to talk a little bit is, but what drew you first into the poultry industry and poultry nutrition specifically?
Yeah, well, thank you, Andy, and great to be here with you today. I started my journey in poultry like pretty early on. I grew up on a family farm in North Georgia. We had layers to start with, and so my first job was to pick up eggs, especially on days where the everyday people were off. That was our job, is to go out and pick eggs up, and I remember I was young, I could only pick up the bottom layer. So my brother had to pick up the top layer, I picked up the bottom layer, and so yeah, that was my introduction to poultry. We had beef cattle too, and as I was growing up, the poultry was a lot of work. I gotta tell you, chickens were a lot of work. I was like, "I want nothing to do with that." If I go back to my 12-year-old self, I probably failed as a career because I said, "That's too much work." But got into the University of Georgia, went into poultry science because that was such an opportunity back in the day, and great department, learned a lot about poultry science there, and, after working for a while, I worked out in the industry for a couple of years after getting my bachelor's degree. I decided to come back to graduate school and eventually found my way into nutrition.
Well, I want to learn more about that and how you got into your current role at Perdue Farms. I love that farm boy upbringing story because it resonates a little bit with me. I always joked that we didn't have dairy cows on the farm, but both my folks were kids of dairy farmers, and you always said they had big families because that was free labor. So here you're talking about being the picking up eggs, like that's why farmers had kids. That's cheap labor. How did you get from that undergraduate start in poultry science and then the nutrition space to this really integral role in the leadership structure at Purdue?
Well, my first job out of school was with a company called British United Turkeys of America, and I was in a tech service research role there, really learning the turkey industry at the time. And a few years into that role, Purdue was a customer of ours, and they reached out to me to say, "Hey, we've got a developmental nutritionist role," and I was fortunate enough to get asked to come join the team, and that's why I got here. I've been able to be here ever since. So
I think it really underscores the importance of relationships. I've always said agriculture is a small town, and the deeper into a given industry you get, the smaller the community becomes. You know everybody, and that's a great example of that. Thinking about Purdue, the things I think about when I think about the company, commitment to animal welfare, commitment to transparency are things that certainly come to the top of my mind. How has your role evolved alongside the company's focus on the way we produce chickens and the responsibility we have as stewards of the birds and everything that goes into responsible production?
yeah. Well, the first thing is Purdue's a family company. It's owned by the Purdue family, and the commitment really starts there. And I think that's really for the folks who are kind of implementing these programs on a day-to-day basis. We got really started in this really early on in my career, and we had great folks that have been instrumental in that process. And as I've took on more responsibility over the years, I've really been able to grow and contribute to the program, but it's really a complete team effort here.
Mentioning some of those innovations and that commitment to production practices,
Yeah.
think about Purdue being one of the first major companies, maybe the first major company to adopt vegetarian feeding program to go into the antibiotic-free production space. So I'm curious from your role, particularly as a scientist and a nutritionist, what were the biggest challenges that you faced when saying, "Hey, this is how we're going to raise our birds," and what were some of the breakthroughs maybe that you saw along the journey of charting that course?
It was really interesting back when we first got challenged with that change. We were really concerned about how birds would grow, would they perform as well? Very concerned about litter quality. Cost was obviously a big factor too. And I'm not saying we got it perfect to start with, but we had to work much more closely with other plant-based proteins, and we had I think we have an advantage there because we have also a sister company, Purdue Agribusiness, which is involved in a lot of the other plant protein trading businesses, such as DDGs and canola and some other plant-based proteins. Access to some of those ingredients really helped us to diversify our diets so we aren't completely reliant on soybean meal as the plant protein.
When you get involved in some of those kind of major policy shifts, what's the conversation like internally? How does the company tap the expertise of someone like yourself, who's a scientist and expert in the field? What do some of those conversations look like in the collaborative process in moving the ball forward toward a given goal, whether it's antibiotics, whether it's the vegetarian diet, or so forth?
Well, we certainly have a lot of meetings about it, right? And we
Yeah.
talk about and we look at what are the options. We also do take a research perspective on any of these things too. We like to know if we do X, what's going to happen, right? Now, one of the other things you may not think about, but is we look at how this is going to affect our farmers, right? The folks who are there day to day raising our birds for us. And I think with the vegetarian diet, that was something that we got a lot of concern initially from farmers about how it was going to affect their paycheck too, right?
Mhm.
And
Sure.
so maybe the birds wouldn't grow as fast and they wouldn't get as many pounds. So
Mm.
certainly that was a concern to start with, and we had to work with some farmers to help them see that we could get as good a performance with a veggie diet as you could with a diet with animal proteins.
Thinking about this from a formulation standpoint, and you think about how you approach crafting a diet for a given production situation, and you just kind of shared some of the concerns that are raised, different stakeholders involved or different constraints involved. How do you approach that, and what are some of the challenges from that initial, oh gosh, we've got to rethink how we feed these birds, to some of the things that you deal with on a day-to-day basis today? How does that approach changed over time?
Initially, we were concerned about cost, but with our access to a lot of plant-based protein, we saw we could be not on par, but pretty close to cost of a regular diet with animal protein. And then it became important to look at what other options were available. And I think certainly over recent years, we've had much more variety of feed ingredients have been a lot better. Certainly, the number of amino acids available to us in formulation. We also were pretty fortunate that when we started animal protein free diets, that there was some changes in the ethanol industry, which gave some good vegetable oils to us that were feed grades. I think that was something that we probably overlook today, but distillers corn oil is something that has been in the industry now for 15 years.
Mhm.
But we were really the first ones to kind of be able to adapt that. We just so happened to be very close, just geographically, to one of the first ethanol plants that started extracting that oil. We're able to access it as a feedstuff. So the timing was fortunate for us.
Mhm.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think a lot of times innovation comes from seeing an opportunity and being able to take advantage of what's handy. Speaking of the idea of innovation, and I'm gonna put on my economist hat for a minute since you mentioned cost earlier. We have some competing interests in animal agriculture, right? We want to be efficient, we want to grow the markets, better, faster, cheaper, all of those kind of things, but we also want to at least maintain, if not outright improve, bird health, and sustainability and this other grab basket of issues that maybe aren't strictly economic or performance related, shall we say. How do you balance all that, as a scientist, as a nutritionist, and as importantly as a executive within the company? How do you balance all of those things that the business needs to be successful, the customers want, and the industry demands, and get it right?
Yeah, well, that's something that we grapple with a lot internally is just that. It's how do we do these things? What is the cost to be Purdue? We call it the cost of veggie diets, the cost of no antibiotics ever, and the cost of producing premium protein. And I think it's fundamental to who we are. And
Mhm.
we work to do whether it's having a better access to sources of ingredients and learning how to have programs in our grow out department that have industry leading animal welfare standards and still have extremely competitive costs. It takes a lot of focus. It's not always the easiest thing to do for sure.
It's a great story. If it were easy, everybody would do it, right? That's,
Sure.
some
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
hard things are hard for a reason, but certainly you guys are doing it well and at scale. One of those areas that I think has been a kind of a signature cost of being Purdue, as you put it, you're known for the leadership position on the antibiotic-free production system. That's not a small thing, right? The really major change in the production. So I'm curious, as you look at that, what are the systems, the strategies, that have made it sustainable for Purdue, and are there lessons learned there that kind of influence how you approach that piece of the puzzle today?
Looking back at the journey that it took us to get to no antibiotics ever, I believe we started our first projects in the early 2000s. And I think that was at a point in time we realized that our consumers and customers were concerned about antibiotics in animal production. We didn't then, and still maybe not today, understand precisely how it may affect things like antimicrobial resistance. But we knew our consumers were concerned about it. And so we started working on things back then. And I remember, there was a paper published in the Applied Journal of Poultry Science when we looked at a large scale study where we took out growth promoting antibiotics, and we could do that. We could still have pretty competitive production without those. And that was in 2002 when our group published that. And the thing that also is, I think, maybe a misconception is that taking antibiotics out of the feed was the hardest part. And in fact, that actually is probably one of the easier parts. Whereas when we go into our hatcheries and on our farms, that was the hard part.
Mm.
And it took years. It took years to really go in and look at how we were doing things. And we had some start and stops along the way. But going back to the breeder farm and looking at how we get hatching eggs, because that's where it starts, right?
Mhm.
That's where it starts. If we don't have a clean hatching egg, we've got no chance throughout the rest of the production chain. So I think that took a lot of work for a lot of different people, and it's still, if I mean, we're still working on it. It's not reached its ultimate conclusion there. We're still working on it.
And the bugs continue to adapt, so we have to adapt as well, right? Kinda smiled when you said taking them out of the feed was the easy part. I wanna make sure we're not underselling this because I'm guessing that nutrition plays a relatively important role in the process of reducing maybe the need for antibiotics and keeping the birds healthy and productive. So I'm curious as that from the initial phase of, well, how do we do it, to now some of those ongoing challenges, how has your team adapted to that responsibility? And what would you say the overall role of nutrition is in making that company brand promise sustainable long term?
I think one of the important things for us was actually we did start on an all veggie feed at the same time that we started no antibiotics ever. So I think that was important for us because while animal proteins can be perfectly good sources of nutrition, they can be variable, and we just feel like we get a better result when we take those out. And lots of research on additives such as probiotics, prebiotics, essential oils, acids, those kind of things. And we're still learning more of those kind of things come out today. And those are very helpful in making this program successful. We take a lot of effort into making sure we have the best litter quality in the industry. That is essential to keep our birds healthy in a no antibiotics ever environment. And I think that is something that we've probably put more emphasis on than maybe others in that space. And I think it's really helped us.
I'm smiling again because in a recent episode we recorded with another past president of the association, Brian Fairchild. We spent a good period of the episode talking about litter quality. So I think it's maybe reflective of the importance that good management plays in the overall picture. So I love when you see a theme from some of the smartest guys in the business emerging. I want to shift a minute from talking about Purdue specifically and the work you've done there. I think it becomes real clear in hearing you tell some of those stories why you were recognized as a fellow of the Poultry Science Association in our 2025 class of honorees. Your leadership at Purdue, your leadership in the industry, but also would highlight your leadership as a past president of PSA, longtime board member, and a contributor really throughout your career. What did it mean to you personally and professionally when you learned that you were being enshrined as a fellow of the society?
It was a great honor, I'll tell you, and I mean, it's not just recognitions from your peers, but it's recognitions from your peers that you have admired because it's the fellows that make that decision, right? And those are the folks that I grew up admiring and really using them as mentors for myself. So having that group to think I was worthy to be a part of it, was really, one of the greatest honors of my career.
That is our highest honor that we bestow on a poultry scientist. And so I'm curious, as you look back over your career, and not that you're hanging up your coveralls anytime soon, but as you look back over the work you've done so far that was deemed worthy by those fellows of this recognition, are there moments, projects, accomplishments that you in particular say, man, I'm really proud of that, or that was something that, was really meaningful to you personally along the way?
I've been involved in several pretty substantial projects here at Purdue. If I have to look at things perhaps in poultry science, focus on the future, focus on the membership and how this organization grows and continues to be a leader in the global poultry science community.
Yeah, well said. And you hit the nail on the head. You served on the board during a very pivotal time in the organization's history, and another part of the reason I think that you are looked at as a great leader in the community. As you are talking to other poultry scientists and members of the industry, and we tend to have maybe a higher concentration of nutritionists in our PSA community because the journals are the top nutrition journals in the industry. Poultry nutrition is evolving rapidly. I'm curious, for you as an expert in the field, what trends or areas of research have you most excited at the moment? What are things that you're reading or thinking about as a nutritionist specifically?
I'm really excited about a number of different things and I'm excited about from the environmental perspective is how we can leverage poultry's efficiency and great story to tell on our environmental footprint. How do we do that? How do we continue to make that something that's going to drive the poultry industry? I'm also really excited about some of the kind of on farm technology we have today and how that is going to change the way we as poultry nutritionists understand, what we do. One of the things that I think as a nutritionist that's hard to understand is that when we change rations, how do we get feedback on what we did? Right? How do we understand that when we make a change that we may think is beneficial, how do we get feedback on that instead of waiting for weeks and weeks and weeks to be able to maybe have an idea that something went right or wrong. So with some of the technology that is available, although some of it is maybe not ready for prime time, but it certainly will be over the next few years, is we'll be able to get faster feedback on things like daily feed consumption, which is going to probably the most direct measure of how the flock is going to do.
Oh, great insights. So that's looking ahead. I'd also love for you to give some advice if you have students who are listening, early career professionals who are listening, whether they're interested in industry, academia. What advice would you give to those who are interested in pursuing a career in poultry, in the poultry industry, and poultry science? Things that you learned along the way that you said, gosh, man, somebody put their arm around me at this stage in my career. Here's what I would have liked for them to tell me.
I think one thing I would tell folks is don't assume what you will eventually do, or don't assume what you'll eventually, become an expert in or be asked to participate in. I'll give you an example of that. And we talked earlier about Purdue's focus on poultry care, animal welfare, and I never thought that I would be doing research in animal behavior. If you would have asked me 20 years ago, I just don't see that happening. But yet, it's probably been some of the most rewarding stuff that I've done in my career because I think we've been able to really make some advancements in that. And that has improved certainly the way we raise our birds. So don't assume that you're always going to work in a specific area, be open to different challenges.
Man, that is such strong advice, Randy. My favorite of the 7 habits that Stephen Covey talked about was begin with the end in mind. Yeah, I think you got to have some idea of where you're going when you start on the journey. But at the same time, I always hate the "where do you see yourself in 5 years" question, because there's probably never been a point in my career where I would have answered that question correctly. The journey isn't as linear as we like to think it is when we're sitting there as undergrads or even
Yeah.
in grad school. So, man, that's such great advice. Dr. Randy Mitchell, what a pleasure. Fellow of the Poultry Science Association, past president, vice president of nutrition at Perdue Farms. Really enjoyed this conversation. Friends, hope you enjoyed it as well. If you did, this is a good reminder. If you haven't already subscribed to Unplucked, subscribe and give us a rating wherever you listen to your podcast. We bring you someone like Dr. Mitchell each week who shares some really brilliant insights into poultry science, the poultry industry, and where we're going as a community. You can check out our social media channels for updates on each week's episode if you're not already subscribing. But again, good idea to do that. And also this week, going on in Macau, China, our PSA Pacific Rim Scientific Conference. So follow all of our social channels for the latest updates from the meeting in Macau. This episode was produced by Lindsay Johnston with editing and engineering by Michael Lunt of Parasol Video. That's it for this week's episode of Unplugged. For the Poultry Science Association, I'm Andy Vance. See you next week.